This week on Filthy Hope.
I often like to use the analogy of a bleeding wound, a hemorrhaging wound. Now, if we think of Aboriginal disadvantage as this hemorrhaging wound that is just there, it's still there, it's still bleeding. The bleeding hasn't been stopped for the last decade or more, even though we're trying. What's been happening, I think, is that we've been putting sort of band-aids on this wound, and it sort of might temporarily stop the bleeding, but eventually they don't work. So the bleeding continues. What we actually need to do is to be reasonable and go, we need to actually get the full first aid kit out. We need to get the wound dressings, the bandages, maybe some stitches, but we need to actually close the wound, patch the wound, and let the wound heal properly. And then we won't need any more band-aids, we won't need any more first aid, because it will be done.
This podcast is a Uniting Heart and Soul production and was recorded on land that was stolen nearly 250 years ago. This particular episode was recorded on the land occupied by the Barramadigal people, a clan of the Darug Nation. We pay our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and we acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. At Filthy Hope, we humbly contribute to the ancient and ongoing traditions of storytelling when we share stories on this podcast. Hello and welcome back to Filthy Hope, the podcast that likes to spend time in the grey spaces where Jesus, life and culture intersect. If you're here for the first time, welcome. My name is Jonty. I'm your host. Usually we would have Rev Ness with us, but she is unwell this week. In lieu of Rev Ness, I have a very special guest with us, Nathan Tyson. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
How are you?
I'm good. It's 9:30, had a coffee. It's all good.
I didn't get the coffee this morning, so I've got the Red Bull instead,
nice.
Which I'm going to be wide in about 3 minutes. So we'll see how that affects this conversation. For people that may not know you, who are you? This is a Uniting Church podcast, so where do you kind of fit into Uniting Church land and that kind of sphere?
It's a good question. Very briefly, I suppose my background, I was born and raised in Sydney till I was about 12. My mum and my mother and stepfather moved to the North Coast, so I then went to boarding school in Lismore for 6 years at a place called St John's College, Woodlawn. Mara's father's all Catholic full boarding. Came back to Sydney, went to uni, did Bachelor of Jurisprudence, Bachelor of Laws, graduated, worked for a number of government agencies, Ombudsman's Office, ICAC, New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board, to name some of them. Ended up at federal level with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. And then I went into corporate. I went over to the National Australia Bank and worked there for a couple of years. Global financial crisis hit. I ended up being made redundant. Then ended up working with an Aboriginal community organisation in Western Sydney called Murrumidigar. They do a range of things, particularly land management, community finance, financial counselling, cultural education and things like that. I went from there over to Western Sydney Uni, where I managed the Badnami Centre, looking after student support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students across, I think it was six or seven campuses. And from there, I ended up in a job with Uniting. I saw a job, Uniting's value statement particularly attracted me, so I applied for a job to work as a church engagement leader with the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress. I did that for a number of years and then ended up moving over into the Uniting's Aboriginal Strategy and Engagement Unit, ASEU. And did some work on the Reconciliation Action Plan, policy, some staff, recruitment, retention type stuff. And then I got tapped on the shoulder by the Gen Sec, Reverend Jane Fry, who said, I'd like you to come work for the Synod and do some work with us. So I accepted that for a 12-month period as a secondment and went over and sort of put together the Walking Together action plan, and did a few other projects with the Synod and got some things rolling. And towards the end of that, the General Secretary said, I'd really like you to stay with us and continue working with us. So long story short, I did. So I'm now working with the Synod in the position of Director, First Peoples Strategy and Engagement. I'm a huge team of one. So I sort of cover all things and across the Synod, everything from, providing advice on policy, looking after the Walking Together action plan. I do a bit of work with UTC, educating formation students. I work with congregations. I go out and talk to congregations about covenanting and the covenant statement and the church's commitment to First Peoples. More recently, I've done a lot of talking to people around the Voice to Parliament and what that is all about and what it looks like. It's a pretty diverse job and, it keeps him busy.
Mm. And for people that are watching, not just listening, will probably have noticed the shirt that you have on today. And so that's largely what I'd love to talk to you about today. And
Great.
I'm sure has been high on your list of conversations that you've been having at work. But also, I've noticed in my personal life, and I'm sure it's the same with you, it's one of the big topics of conversation.
Yeah.
We'll get into some of the more specific detail stuff about what it is and the pros and cons and that whole conversation as we go on. But I wonder, in your position, from my perspective as someone who isn't working in these spaces, this conversation seems to have been a recent thing, but that obviously comes from my position of because from my particular worldview, my perspective, it's not something that is constantly in my sphere. And so I guess for someone in your position, could you maybe explain where this conversation has come from and why it's got to where it is now, and the importance of this current conversation as a not an endpoint, but a progression of a conversation and something that's actually been brewing and progressing for a long period of time?
Mm. Yeah, where to start on that question? I suppose as early as 1938 and potentially earlier, but in 1938, and now I'm not going to be able to remember the gentleman's name. For some reason, it always escapes me, even though William Cooper. William Cooper was sort of a rights-based advocate, Christian advocate, and he had been protesting about a number of things with a number of people, and he had led a protest originally the day of mourning, which churches still sort of honour today as the Sunday before the 26th of January. And he had actually written to the King seeking representation in Parliament for Aboriginal people. So it's sort of been the idea of a voice to Parliament or representation of some sort in Parliament's been around for a long time. Similarly, I think, the call for treaty and truth-telling have been around for a very long time. Some people will know that, in the late 70s, probably from even the 60s, people have been marching for treaty and other rights, land rights and recognition of sovereignty. So in a national sense, for many, many years, at least a decade, governments have been sort of consulting about and thinking through what constitutional recognition for Aboriginal people would look like. I can't remember the exact date offhand. I should have done more homework. But certainly through a number of prime ministers and a number of governments, there's been this discussion around constitutional recognition. There's been a couple of committees formed to look into it, to do research on it. And that process sort of culminated with the decision to run the dialogues, the Uluru dialogues. So there were 12 regional dialogues held around the country with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representatives. Roughly about 1,200 representatives attended those dialogues. And then that was followed by the Constitutional Convention at Uluru. And at that Constitutional Convention, there are roughly about 250 delegates. They sat for a number of days and talked through the issues. And ultimately they produced the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which essentially advocated for voice, treaty and truth. and that statement was read to the Australian people by Professor Megan Davis. So that's sort of a very brief version of how we got here. So the current sort of discussion is primarily about the voice aspect of Voice Treaty Truth, but it's really important to remember that the statement from the heart, while it did have a sequencing of Voice Treaty Truth, each of those elements was seen as equally important by the delegates. The other thing I'll just quickly mention is that there were some delegates, I believe, maybe around, I've heard 7 mentioned, but potentially up to 20 delegates who left the discussion at Uluru at some point because they weren't happy with the way that the discussion was going, and that's okay. We're a diverse community. Aboriginal people are very diverse peoples. We have lots of views about lots of things, and it's a democracy in that sense. So some people weren't happy. They walked out of the dialogue, but the vast majority of people stayed and progressed that process through to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So, yeah.
And I guess to fully texture this conversation so we can get to some stuff that I'm really interested to talk about, just maybe for listeners who at this point are still not fully caught up on what they hear it on the news, they hear it in conversation, Voice to Parliament. Can you maybe just briefly, what is it and why is it important?
Yeah, so the Voice to Parliament, I mean, there seems to be a lot of confusion and quite a bit of misinformation floating around that it's all, a whole bunch of things, that it's going to cause all sorts of disastrous things. Look, it's actually a really simple concept. What it is about is providing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with a voice to advise government, to give advice to government and Parliament, just advice, non-binding advice to government on matters that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it's about being able to give advice to help develop laws, policies and programs that are designed to address disadvantage in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, programs, policies and laws that are designed to address disadvantage and close the gap. So it's simply about giving the people that are most affected the opportunity to have input through advice into the development of the things that are meant to help them. So it's quite simple. It's not sort of I don't understand why people get particularly confused about it. Maybe they're reading things on social media or listening to certain news outlets that claim that the voice is something it's not. But the thing to remember is that the voice will be non-binding. So the advice, it's just advice. Government can take it or leave it. In some ways, if you're going to be worried about anything about the voice, it could be that government might not listen to it or Parliament might not listen to it. But they might, and they hopefully will in good faith. And if government listens, any process of decision making, whether you're running an organisation or a community organisation or a business, like you want to get feedback from your stakeholders. You want to get advice from the people that you're trying to serve or that you're trying to work with to know how best to do that. Like what are the solutions that they think are going to work, or what are the services that they want you to provide them. The same with community development and addressing disadvantage. It's important to know what the people on the ground who are experiencing the disadvantage see as the issues and also see as the solution. I think for a long time, government and Parliament and bureaucrats have been sort of working, potentially with best intentions, but doing it maybe from an academic background or from a one-size-fits-all background or from thinking they know best background, rather than spending the time or rather than having an effective mechanism where they could actually hear from the people that they were trying to help, where they could actually hear the on-the-ground experience, the on-the-ground realities, and then design things and tailor things that actually work to meet those needs. And that's what the voice is about. So in terms of consultation, the voice will have a regional and local structure as well. So it will have, I'm just guessing, but common sense would suggest that in terms of consulting with local and regional communities, which is where the representatives will be selected from, you're going to need an office or two in each state and territory. You're going to need some staff to go out and consult with communities about issues. that feedback will then be passed up through the representatives to the national body, and then from there be given to either government or parliament, either to the particular department or to the cabinet, or whoever the relevant body is within the government, or to parliament. So it's a really good consultative sort of model, I suppose you would say. It's designed to actually facilitate feedback from on the ground, advice from on the ground, information from on the ground, up through the model to the national body, who can then give that advice directly to the parliament or to the government. And I've had people say to me, for example, but how are they going to work out what advice to give? Like, how are they going to decide which is the best advice? And I think that comes from a position of thinking that whatever the advice is needs to be just one simple, like, this is what you have to do about this issue. When the reality is the advice might be that, for example, in a remote or a regional area, the needs of the communities and the issues in the community and the solutions for those communities might be very different, for example, to communities in urban areas. So if it's an issue like housing, for example, the needs of remote communities in relation to housing may be quite different to the needs of an urban community in relation to housing. But there's nothing to stop all of that feedback coming up to the voice, and the voice then providing advice to the government and parliament to say, look, in relation to urban settings, this is the sort of advice, these are the suggestions that we give you. In relation to more remote communities, this is the feedback we've got, and therefore this is the advice that we're going to give you in relation to how to approach that. So there doesn't necessarily have to just be one advice. It might actually be advice with a number of options, whether it's geographic or contextual or that sort of thing. So it's that's what the voice is. It's an advisory body. It will have no veto power. So people might remember Malcolm Turnbull right at the start of the discussion around the voice saying, it's a third chamber of parliament, and he dismissed the voice out of hand. The voice will have no veto power, so it can't overturn or negate or veto decisions of the government or of the parliament. So it's not, in that sense, a third chamber of parliament. It just simply isn't. And someone has told me that Malcolm Turnbull sort of retracted that claim and has since apologised for that statement, which is great. It's purely an advisory body to give advice. Take it or leave it advice. It won't impact parliamentary process. It won't impact government process, decision-making process. So Parliament will still make the decisions the same way it always has, via the elected members making the decisions. Government and government departments will still make decisions the same way they always have. The benefit they'll have is a bit of extra advice to help them hopefully make better decisions. So that's what the voice is.
Yeah, I mean, makes complete sense to me. It's interesting you bring up that there's a fair whack of misinformation and misinterpretation maybe and misconceptions around what. Are there any other big major things that you hear crop up more than once where people have got it wrong? And
there's a number of things, and I think it's important. I might just talk first about people may hear that, some Aboriginal people don't support the voice. And that's true. Some Aboriginal people don't, but there are sort of legitimate reasons in a sense for that. So one of those reasons is that for many decades, if not centuries, Aboriginal people have been told by various governments over the years, no, this is for your benefit. Just trust us. You'll be fine. This is good for you. And lived experience has been that hasn't been the case. A lot of detrimental things have been done by government through application of policy and programs to Aboriginal people. So lived experience is don't trust the government. They tell you it'll be good for you, but will it really? And probably the most recent example of that is the Northern Territory intervention that was meant to have all these beneficial outcomes for Aboriginal peoples and in fact caused, I would argue, a lot more harm than good in communities. It was quite a negative impact for a lot of people and communities. And And in fact, the government had to suspend the Racial Discrimination Act in order to implement that legislation. So there was an inherent recognition that the legislation was targeted towards Aboriginal people and was therefore would have been subject to the Race Discrimination Act, but they suspended it. So they actually used the constitutional ability to suspend the operation of that act to implement a law that was only for Aboriginal people. So, for example, when you hear people saying, "Oh, but it's putting, the Voice is putting race in the Constitution," the Constitution has had race in it for a long time, and it has been used particularly for laws for Aboriginal people. So this it's not a new thing in terms of race being in the Constitution. It's been there for a long time and has been used to the detriment, I would argue, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at times as well. This is about putting something positive and beneficial in, to the Constitution in terms of putting the voice in there. And people say, but why should it be in there? Well, we've had other Aboriginal organisations that have advocated for the interests of Aboriginal peoples previously that have been created by legislation but have then been also abolished by abolishing the legislation. So putting it in there in the Constitution means it can't just be gotten rid of because of some political sort of motivation or decision. Anyway, back to my reasons why Aboriginal people don't support the Voice. Some Aboriginal people. I should say polls have suggested 80% of Aboriginal people, 86% of Aboriginal people, 83% of Aboriginal people are in support of the Voice. And that's my general sense from people, Aboriginal people, friends, family, colleagues that I talk to, is that there is a really big groundswell of support. So generally speaking, hand on heart, the majority of Aboriginal people are for the Voice and they see it as a really good idea. So some Aboriginal people think, don't trust the government, just don't trust them. I don't care what they say to me, I'm not going to trust them. I get that. I understand that wariness and scepticism. It's got a reasonable foundation. Another thing that I've seen going around on social media and some people saying is that the Voice will somehow impact the sovereignty, the unceded sovereignty of First Nations in Australia. Again, I get the fear because sovereignty is an important issue to Aboriginal peoples. We never ceded sovereignty of our nations. We didn't have the opportunity to cede sovereignty because of the use of the doctrine of terra nullius. So when the British arrived, they said, oh, look, it's terra nullius. There's no one here. So, of course, you can't recognise someone that you say isn't there. You similarly can't recognise their sovereignty. And similarly, there was no treaty formed because you probably can't form a treaty with someone who you say isn't here. So that doctrine of terra nullius had a big impact way back. We weren't like New Zealand that had the Treaty of Waitangi. And in fact, every other British colonised country today has a treaty with its First Peoples, except for Australia. And Australia was also the only country where the doctrine of terra nullius was applied. So I think there's a pretty strong correlation between that. But yeah, so some Aboriginal people are concerned that, recognising us in the Constitution will somehow mean that we've ceded our sovereignty. This is just not true. It's just not true. International law doesn't work that way. It just simply doesn't. And one analogy, for example, I would give is that, and I've mentioned this a few times in talks I give, is, New Zealanders are our friends. New Zealand's just over the water. They're just over there. We've got an Anzac tradition. We fought wars with our New Zealand brothers and sisters. Maybe one day someone might suggest that, hey, let's give New Zealand a voice to our parliament and government so that we can hear what New Zealanders think about how we have a good relationship with their country. And so we decide, we'll have a referendum to put a New Zealand voice in our constitution. So we have the referendum, Australians vote and go, we love New Zealanders, we'll give them a voice. And the next day, the voice is created, it's enshrined in the constitution. Would the Australian government be able to turn around and say to New Zealand, fantastic, you've just ceded your sovereignty to us? Of course not. No. It can't happen. I mean, other things I tend to think of are things like, if that was the way the ceding of sovereignty worked, there would be no need for armed conflict. You would just have a referendum in your own country and go, oh, by the way, we've just taken your sovereignty. The reality is it doesn't work that way. It simply doesn't work that way. So while I get the fear of people being scared about losing their sovereignty or somehow ceding their sovereignty, It's simply this voice referendum and this particular process where 97% of the people who vote are going to be non-Aboriginal people, roughly. It simply can't impact sovereignty. It doesn't work that way. So I get the fear and I understand and I empathise with people who are scared in that sense. What I would say to them is it's just not the case. It won't happen. It just won't happen that way. There's another reason that I'm just struggling to put my finger on. Anyway, but there are two reasons. There is another one that I just can't think of. It's escaping me at the moment. It'll probably come to me.
We can come back to it if you remember.
Either in 5 minutes or at 2 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. But yeah, so there are some reasons. In terms of some of the things I've heard about from sort of non-Aboriginal people are claims, for example, that it will destroy our parliamentary process, or it'll destroy our parliamentary sovereignty. This is simply not true. As I've said, the Voice is an advisory body. It's just advice. It's non-binding advice. The Voice principles and the Kalma-Langton report all say it will be non-binding. And the reality is, if people were seeking a voice that was binding or that had a veto power, it simply would not succeed. There is no way the Australian people would allow that. The people that were behind this ask for the Voice, they know that some things are just unrealistic. So what they've asked for is a really modest, non-binding, non-veto power advisory body. So it won't impact decision-making in Parliament. Like the MPs, our elected MPs, will still be responsible for decision-making. The Voice won't be making decisions on behalf of the Parliament or the government. Similarly, government bureaucrats, public servants and relevant ministers and the government will make the decisions on behalf of the government as they always have. As I said earlier, just with the benefit of some good advice that will hopefully mean better outcomes. What else have I heard? I've heard, it will cost a lot of money. It's going to cost a lot of millions and millions of dollars. Certainly it will cost money. Reality is that, creating any agency or any body you've got to pay people, to do work. That's just the way the world works. But what the Voice is designed to do primarily is to address disadvantage. It's designed to provide advice to government and Parliament to get better laws, policies and programs that will hit the ground and address disadvantage, that will close the gap, that will focus on issues like youth suicide, like overrepresentation in custody, like overcrowded housing, like poor infrastructure, like high rates of infant mortality, chronic illness and disease in communities, preventable illness and disease. These are the things that the policies and programs and laws are going to be better designed to improve those things. So I often like to use the analogy of a bleeding wound, a hemorrhaging wound. Now, if we think of Aboriginal disadvantage as this hemorrhaging wound that is just there, it's still there, it's still bleeding. The bleeding hasn't been stopped for the last decade or more, even though we're trying. What's been happening, I think, is that we've been putting sort of band-aids on this wound, and it sort of might temporarily stop the bleeding, but eventually they don't work. So the bleeding continues. What we actually need to do is to be reasonable and go, we need to actually get the full first aid kit out. We need to get the wound dressings, the bandages, maybe some stitches, but we need to actually close the wound, patch the wound, and let the wound heal properly. And then we won't need any more band-aids, we won't need any more first aid because it will be done. So I look at disadvantage like that, in that we have been spending, and the critics will tell you, they can probably quote the amount of money that's been spent on Aboriginal disadvantage over the years. The thing to remember is that our communities don't like living in disadvantaged circumstances. Our people do not like our young people dying, our people dying in custody, our elders dying early from chronic illness. We do not like that. We do not want that. Like, who would want that? So we want that solved. That is our focus. That is what we desperately want to see fixed. So yes, lots of money's been spent, but for some reason it hasn't fixed the problem. The Band-Aids aren't working. So yes, we will need to spend some money on the Voice, but ultimately, if we can actually, get the full first aid kit out, close the wound, let it heal, we will need to stop. We won't need to keep spending money on Band-Aids, i.e. if we can bring levels of disadvantage down, if we can address chronic health issues, if we can reduce the need for services, it will actually save the country money over the medium to long term. It will actually save money. So yes, you do need to invest a little bit at the front end and the medium term, but in the long term, hopefully, a lot of those wounds will be healed. So we won't need to keep spending money on first aid stuff. And that's the logical, rational approach to this. Aboriginal people don't want to be in disadvantaged circumstances. I think most reasonable Australians don't want to see Aboriginal people and communities in disadvantaged circumstances. And I think most people would see it logical that, look, well, let's just do what we need to do to fix this. And the voice, it's not the magic wand. It won't, obviously, creating the voice won't just solve all the problems overnight. It's not going to be that sort of solution. But what it will do is over the short to medium term enable the government and Parliament to access just better advice about how to tweak programs, tailor programs and policies to make sure they fit better and have more effective outcomes on the ground. That over time will actually save us money. So people saying, oh, it's going to cost all this money. Sure, it will cost money, but it's money well spent. It's addressing human need. Yeah. It's not money spent on, for example, submarines that we could argue, do we need them or not need them? It's not one of those sort of discretionary-ish type things. This is about the lives of human beings. It's not discretionary. We're a first world country. We should be willing to spend the money that we need to improve the lives of all Australians, but particularly in this case, First Nations Australians. I also recently had someone mention to me, but look, I grew up in an area where there were lots of disadvantaged non-Aboriginal Australians, and I think it's unfair that they're not getting help. And I was a bit taken aback because I said, look, I have certainly never argued that anyone in disadvantage shouldn't be helped by the government. And personally, I think all Australians who are in situations of disadvantage should be being supported and assisted by the government. I've never argued anything different. In terms of the voice, this is particularly about how do we actually address disadvantage impacting First Peoples. It's not to say that the government shouldn't be doing stuff to address disadvantage impacting everyone else. And in fact, I said to this gentleman, the reality is that all of our current systems of government, of Parliament, of health, housing, education, all of those systems, in essence, are designed by non-Aboriginal people for non-Aboriginal people. So they're sort of tailored to meet the needs of non-Aboriginal people. The challenge we have in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander disadvantage is that because of a whole range of factors, including cultural factors, geographic factors, language factors, the way that we develop and implement programs and policies needs to be slightly different to hit the mark, to actually do the good that they need to do. So certainly the voice isn't saying that we only want the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander disadvantage to be addressed and we don't want to care about anyone else. Not saying that at all. What we're saying is, and certainly as Christians, I mean, our faith mandates that we care about all people in disadvantaged circumstances. Good Samaritan story, we don't walk past the injured man on the road. The sheep and the goats story, in Matthew says we'll be judged on how we treat the least in our community. So as Christians, we are compelled to care about people in disadvantaged circumstances and to do our best to help those people. So sorry, my phone is buzzing. Just let me turn it off. So yes, will we need to spend some money? Yes, we will. Is that quite reasonable? Yes, it is.
Hey everyone, just interrupting this episode to briefly talk to you about our live events. If you're a fan of this show and you want to come and hang out with myself and Ness, as well as be in the live audience for a taping of the podcast, then you should definitely look at coming along to one of our live events. These events are totally free, and as well as the podcast, there is always live music, food and drink, and just a really great opportunity to hang out with and share stories with all sorts of different people. If you're interested, there is a link to our Eventbrite profile down below where you can see all upcoming events and book your spot to make sure that you don't miss out. We look forward to seeing you at the next live event. That's all, And now, back to the episode.
What else have I heard? I mean, I do often get sort of people mentioning that, but, all this stuff happened a long time ago. You know, like colonisation was a long time ago. The stolen generations was a long time ago. The stolen wages was a long time ago. Discrimination was a long time ago. Why should we have to worry about that now? And often people say to me, because I didn't do anything. Like, why should I feel responsible?
Yeah.
Now, I'm really quick to say to people, look, this I don't think I've ever said to anyone you should feel guilty, because I don't think that way. But I do have a lot of people say to me, why should I feel guilty? I think the reality is that when people become aware of the truth of the colonisation of this country and they hear the actual lived experience and the truth of things like the stolen generations, the forced removal of children from their families, the number of massacres that have occurred, the enslavement of Aboriginal people, the stolen wages of Aboriginal people, the dispossession of Aboriginal people, when they actually hear these stories and sort of stop and think about them, they're actually in most cases, they're just horrendous stories. They are horrendous examples of what one human being or a group of human beings can do to another human being or group of human beings. They're just horrible. So as a decent human being, when you hear these stories, I think what we feel is sadness, like a deep sadness, a deep regret, even though we didn't do it, we can still feel that, we can still have that empathy and that compassion, and that impacts people, and they feel really bad. And I think for some people that translates in their head to guilt. Sure. That's the word they use to explain that feeling crappy about what's happened. But it's not guilt. It's just a recognition, I think, of how horrible some of these things were. And I would suggest to people that rather than feeling guilty, what we need to do is to translate that feeling of how horrible was that into what can we do to address that today. Because the reality is, even though a lot of these things happened many decades or a long time ago, the legacy impacts of those things continue to affect Aboriginal peoples and communities. So the gap that we have in socioeconomic statistics is a legacy resulting directly from policies and programs and actions of government and others in the past. So the fact that Aboriginal people were denied access to employment, denied access to education, were put on missions and reserves and not allowed to go anywhere, those types of government policies have meant that generations of Aboriginal people were significantly disadvantaged. Health, housing, education, those sorts of things. So today we're trying to recover from the impacts of all those things. So yes, some of the things happened a long time ago. Mind you, the issue of removal of children from their families is still really huge in that more Aboriginal children have been removed since the apology than were removed before the apology. The system of the removals has slightly changed in that these days it's a in inverted commas child protection system that is doing those removals. But nevertheless, we are seeing huge numbers of Aboriginal children removed from their families and also often removed from their community contact as well. That's not meant to happen under the current policy, but in reality it does. So these are legacy impacts that are still there today. And the other thing is we have people still living who were stolen from their families. We have members of the stolen generation that are still alive today that went through that stuff, that were abused in institutions, that suffered immense grief and trauma. So, yes, a lot of stuff happened a long time ago, still impacting today. And as a nation, we have the opportunity to address it. And I think also, certainly as Christians, we have a faith-based obligation to try and provide redress and reparations and reconciliation. In my view, we're all working towards reconciliation, but you can't just say, look, okay, we'll just be reconciled. There needs to be an acknowledgement of what's happened, of the wrong done. there needs to be some sort of restitution or redress to, in terms of restorative justice, to put things back as close as we can as to how they should be, and then some time for healing, and then we'll get to a point of being reconciled. But that's a journey and a process. I mean, truth-telling is part of that, and I think the treaty is part of that as well in terms of the disposition aspect and the restorative justice aspect of that.
Yeah. Something you said just a little bit earlier really, really just resonated with me, because it was something that really, really was not making sense in my mind. We do an acknowledgement of country at the beginning of this episode, which listeners will have already heard. And when we started doing that, we got a handful of messages, and one really stuck out to me. Why on earth would you bother doing that? That's so stupid. It happened so long ago. You're just guilt-tripping people like me who, have inherited this generational trauma, and the blame is being put on me. I had nothing to do with it. What's the point? It happened so long ago. And there was also a line of like, well, it's not their land anymore, so why do we need to talk about it? And part of our, which did also seem ironic to me, because part of the acknowledgement of country is the acknowledgement that sovereignty was never ceded. And just when you were talking then about how perhaps that is the result of really actually recognising the weight and the degree to which that trauma is real and is still real,
100%,
really generates this grief, this sadness, and not knowing where to place that. Because to me, at the time, I was like, where on earth is it? I cannot actually wrap my head around how a person can come to that level of, I wouldn't even know how to describe that stance and where that comes from, but that really, really contextualizes that to me. And I wonder for how many people that is the case, where suddenly they, through no fault of their own, they were born in Australia in the late 90s or the 2000s or whenever, and they're now, culturally, there's this huge conversation around something that they feel immense guilt and grief and sadness about. And where do you place that?
Yeah.
That really, really just resonates with me.
Look, I think one of the things that I find is that, and I've noticed this in the last 30 years, is that as the education in our school system, in the curriculum, has improved around sort of colonisation and what happened and early colonial sort of impacts and the impacts of colonisation on First Peoples across the nation, talking about things like massacres and like the stolen generations. As our young people have actually learned about that stuff through their schooling, particularly through their high schooling, the attitudes of young people are markedly different than people, sort of in my age bracket and older. Because when I went to school, I was literally taught that Captain Cook discovered Australia.
Same.
That was, and for all the decades previous, that was what people were taught. There was no mention of it. Like Aboriginal people were sort of, might get a brief mention as, there were these sort of savage, noble, savagey type people that, lit fires and hunted and killed kangaroos and threw boomerangs. Like a really oversimplified, like, really unflattering, dismissive sort of description of Aboriginal peoples and communities. And so that was sort of, that was the education. Around my sort of era, and then certainly 10 years later, I've got two younger sisters who are 10 years younger than me, and I know they got a really reasonable education around sort of Aboriginal people and culture and colonisation and how that all happened. So I know that a lot of our young people have actually had a pretty reasonable education around this stuff, and you'll actually find heaps of young people, joining us in marches, advocating for social justice, advocating for change, advocating for the voice. Younger people in general get this stuff. And certainly young people in our church are some of our best social justice advocates, because they see the connection between social justice and our faith, which is just awesome. Shout out to places like Leichhardt Uniting and Newtown Mission and Pitt Street Uniting and all those places that do this stuff so well. It's things are improving, but the reality is also still that a lot of the people in positions of power, in decision-making positions in our country, are older people. Often they're older men. And unfortunately, a lot of those people didn't get the benefit of having that broader education about Aboriginal peoples and culture and colonisation and impacts and those sorts of things. So in some ways, they're just very ignorant because they don't have the knowledge. The frustrating thing is that, in 2023, when you've got almost anything available via a Google search, these people can actually do some research and look into this history and read about the issues and the impacts and inform themselves about those things. And sadly, I think some people are willfully ignorant. They choose not to look into those things too deeply because, if you've held certain views for a long period of your life, it's probably really difficult to consider trying to change them because what it means is accepting that you've actually been wrong for a lot of your life. So some people tend to dig their heels in even harder and fight against it rather than just saying, "Oh, I didn't know. I've been wrong about that, and I'm sorry. Let's see what we can do to fix those things." People actually dig their heels in and go, "No, I'm not wrong, and why should I feel guilty?"
Yeah,
and that's the sort of defence. I'm not going to feel guilty about any of that stuff because it wasn't me. Rather than saying, look, some really crappy things happened. Sure, I wasn't there, but I should understand them and know about them, and I should contribute to positive things to try and do what I can in whatever way I can to help address in terms of restorative justice those things. Because it's not about feeling guilty about what has happened. And I often say, like, none of us have got a time machine. We can't go back in time and change anything, or we can't go back in time and say, look, don't use terra nullius, actually put a treaty in place and things will be much better moving forward. We can't do that. What we can do is to look at the current structures and practices and policies and approaches that sort of have those elements of history in them and go, how can we actually tweak those things, improve those things, make those things be more inclusive and more effective in terms of how they benefit, addressing disadvantage, for example, of Aboriginal people. We can do that. And that's what The Voice is. It's a practical, sensible, modest way of helping government and parliament to go, all right, we're accepting that, while we've had the best of intentions, what we've been doing isn't working. 4 of 19 closing the gap targets have progressed. The other 15 haven't. And we've been at this for over a decade. Governments have been trying to fix this stuff, and for whatever reason, it's not working. And you can look at that as a number, 4 out of 19. You can look at the chronic illness, infant mortality, youth suicide statistics. You can look at the numbers, and the numbers show clearly this is an issue. It's a really serious issue. But what I would encourage people to do is don't think about the numbers. Think about the people, the human beings, the families, the husbands, wives, uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews that are in the middle of this disadvantage. So if you're in a community and a young person commits suicide, that has massive impacts across that community. The grief, the trauma, the anger, and this is happening way too often. When our people die from preventable causes in custody, this is someone's mother, father, son, daughter, uncle, niece, nephew. This is someone's loved one, and they pass away from causes that were preventable. If the proper policies were followed, if some compassion was shown, if some human decency was shown, this person probably wouldn't have died. As a relative of someone who passes away in those circumstances in custody, put yourself in their shoes. How much grief would there be? How angry would you be? How much would you feel that you deserve some justice in that circumstance? And when you consider that over 544 or 45, it's probably more because it seems to go up every week, well over 500 people have died since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in 1991. That's over 500 family members, over 500 sons, daughters, uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews. That's a lot of people. And that just contributes to the ongoing sense of grief and trauma and loss and anger and frustration in our communities. So, while it's often challenging for us to see Aboriginal people protesting and being very angry and very upset, there's a legitimate basis for that grief, and it's grief and trauma and anger, legitimate, because people are crying out for help, please help address this stuff. Please help us stop our people committing suicide. Please help us stop our people being, dying in jails from preventable causes. It's a cry, it's a plea, and again, that's why I think The Voice, in terms of enabling those communities to provide advice in terms of what the solutions are to stop this stuff happening, is really critical. And yes, government can take or leave the advice, but most sensible leaders will take on board good advice, and that's the hope. And the advice from The Voice to the government or to Parliament will be on the public record. It will be, it should be FOIable. There will be intense media scrutiny of The Voice. So all Australians, if they wish, will be able to find out exactly what advice the Voice is providing to the government. And similarly, we'll be able to keep an eye on, what's the government doing about it? Or what's the Parliament doing about it? People say, who's going to hold the government accountable for it? Well, in some ways, The Voice won't be able to hold the government accountable because they can only provide advice. But the Australian people can hold the government accountable and the Parliament accountable, because the Australian people elect politicians. So if the Australian people find it in their heart to support The Voice and want The Voice to be there because they want that issue, those issues of disadvantage to be addressed, one would hope that the Australian people will also have an expectation that our Parliament and our government will take reasonable steps to implement things and to tweak things and to take on board the advice to get the effective outcomes on the ground to address the disadvantage. And if that doesn't happen because a particular political party or because a particular MPs rail against doing that, well, maybe the Australian people in their electorate at the next election will say, you know what, we want someone else. We want someone who actually will listen to good advice. And maybe those politicians won't be in Parliament anymore. So there is a level of accountability here through the polls. It's how our democratic process works. It's maybe not the immediate accountability that some people might think there should be, but it certainly is accountability. So The Voice will be transparent, the advice will be transparent, the responses of government, if through nothing else other than the close the gap reporting, if we don't see changes, we'll know that things aren't working. If we start seeing changes, maybe the advice is working. Maybe things are being tweaked and changed and done differently, and some actions being taken. So, look, and I heard Linda Burney say, and I've heard Anthony Albanese say, and there is nothing to lose by having a crack at The Voice, and there is everything to gain. What we have to gain is less young people committing suicide, is people not dying earlier, our infant mortality rates dropping, people living longer because they're not being impacted by chronic disease and illness, less of our people dying in custody. Sadly, the reality is some people will pass away in custody from natural causes. That is part of life. What we're talking about is those people who pass away from preventable causes. So when people go into custody with chronic health issues or issues that have arisen through their arrest or that process, they get into custody, they complain that they're not well, that they're feeling pain or they're sick, and they're just dismissed. It's like, and I've seen footage where corrections people will say, they're just coming off drugs, and it's just this dismissive thing. When, people have got serious head injuries or, other serious internal injuries, and they end up dying from them because someone didn't go, the policy says I should call a medical professional, a medical expert to come and look at these people to make sure they're actually okay. There's this sort of decision made that they know better, they don't need help, they're fine. And in fact, they did, and they pass away. So it's that sort of stuff, I think, that we really need, as a nation, we need to work together to stop that sort of stuff happening, because every human being deserves, a fair go and dignity and respect. People shouldn't be dying because of a lack of human dignity and respect, which is effectively what happens in a lot of cases.
And I guess one last thread to pull in this conversation before we wrap this up. We were talking beforehand about, this intersection that we've kind of touched on already between this issue and the church. And, I have had experiences in my church settings where this conversation has come up that have been incredibly, powerfully positive. But I've also had conversations on that other side of that spectrum where, you bring theology in it and all of a sudden you've got all these different strands of theology.
Yep.
Sometimes for different people, they don't intersect. Whereas, I guess first, being a Christian as well, how do you see that intersection? What are the important things, the important steps that people can take maybe to ease that crossover in places where that might be tricky for some people? Because it is hard for some people. I'm not going to throw any names under the bus, but emails about why the Christian yes vote is not a Christian, that sort of thing. You know.
Yeah. So for me, it's really quite simple, and I suppose personally, I was fortunate in a sense to go to a Marist Catholic school, boarding school. We went to church every day and twice on Sundays, literally. So I got a lot of sermons, but the focus of Marist is on Mary as the mother of Christ, and about her compassion, and about her mercy, and about the way she, dealt with her, the difficult things in her life. So right from an early age, I sort of had this, I suppose, faith-based sense of mercy and compassion and, looking after people. Now, more recently I've done a little bit of theological study, and thinking, and, so when I think about helping anyone in need, really, the first story I think of is the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's a really clear story. Everyone knows it, so I won't go into it. But, basically what that says is, the good neighbour is the one that stops and helps the injured man in the road, not the person that walks past. And, I've had cause to say in the past that, if you're on your way to church and you walk past someone that's injured or disadvantaged in the road, you might as well turn around and go home, because your duty is actually to stop and help, to do what you can to assist somebody in that time of need. And then if we, Jesus says, the two greatest commandments are to love your God with all your heart and all your soul, and to love your neighbour as yourself. So as Christians, in all of our interactions with whoever we meet, we should be treating those people with dignity and respect, because that's what we would like. That's how we would like to be treated. So then I think about the parable of the sheep and the goats, about Jesus saying that, at the end of our days, we will be judged on how we have treated the least in our society. And, again, it's like, don't walk past the injured person in the road. Like how have you treated the least? Have you, clothed people, fed people, housed people, visited people in their time of need? Have you done all of those things? We're not going to be judged on how big our church is, or how many people are sitting in the pews, or on how good our car is, or how big our house is, or how much money we've got in the bank, or whether we're wearing designer label clothes. We won't be judged on any of that. And in fact, the things we will be judged on, about, did we provide clothing? Did we feed someone? Did we visit them when they needed it? Do we care for them when they're sick? Anyone can do those things. It doesn't matter what your level of sort of affluence or privilege is. All of us can do that. So when I think about the parable of the Good Samaritan and the sheep and the goats message about what we will be judged on, it's about helping people in need. It's about helping people in disadvantaged circumstances. It's about not judging, because our job isn't to judge, our job is to love. So we have here in Australia a group of people, of human beings, who are suffering significant disadvantage. There is a very practical, reasonable, modest proposal that everyone concerned that's developed this and designed this and is supporting this believes will make a positive difference in addressing that disadvantage. So I feel quite comfortable in saying that as Christians we should support this. We should support the voice. That's my particular theological take on it. I have heard people sort of with some different takes on it, but I honestly think, with the parable of the Good Samaritan and the sheep and the goats passage, they're pretty straightforward messages. And in fact, Good Samaritan says all of the laws and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Love your God, love your neighbour, treat your neighbour as yourself.
Yeah.
If we see Aboriginal people as our neighbours, which we should be treating them the way we would like to be treated.
Oh, and to me, it's also that simple thing of seeing and recognising the image of God 100%. In every single person that you come across. Yeah. In the same way that you would want people to see and recognise the image of God in who you are as a unique, beautiful individual.
Absolutely.
Doing that for everyone. Like,
that's right.
There's no like Jesus doesn't stutter in either of those parables. No. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward.
And I do honestly think that sometimes it's easy to forget that Jesus wasn't a white man.
Yeah.
He wasn't a Anglo-European.
Yeah.
He would have had brown skin, and a lot of people sadly would have seen him as other. But he wasn't. He was Jesus. So as Christians, I think, and I often say, Jesus doesn't say, love your Christian neighbour or love your affluent neighbour or love the neighbour that's just immediately next door to you. He says love your neighbour. So, and that's a very broad definition. So every human being as part of creation, every human is your neighbour. So love everyone.
Yeah.
Whether they're Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, Sikh, Muslim, Christian, black, white, whatever. Love them.
Yeah.
The world would be a much better place if we all just did that.
Absolutely. And I think in church spaces when we this is one of a number of, I think of the same-sex marriage debate that's been it's still a thing, and the LGBTQI plus. Like there are a number of different conversations and issues, this being one of them, that just cause so much angst and disagreement and argument, particularly not just in church spaces, but especially in church spaces. And in my experience with this, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, in my experiences in church spaces, the really, really positive experiences where people with all different opinions have been in the same space and still been, happily, in some cases, happy to disagree. In some cases, opinions haven't changed but have been open to change, have largely been in spaces where people can share stories and can share experience. We have, at my current, in my congregation, we have, and I now can't remember the name of the town, but our student minister went to a memorial service for
Mile Creek.
That's the one. Yep. And just hearing them come back and tell that story, and sitting as a congregation, as a group, and like all different perspectives in the congregation. Let me tell you, all different perspectives, and just listening to a story and going, these are real people.
Yep.
This is recent history. It reminds me a little bit of the way you hear discourse in the United States around slavery, as if it's this distant thing. No. This is recent history that we are still wrestling with the aftermath of. And not throwing opinions around, not going, well, I think the Bible says this, and not just listening to a story and letting it resonate.
Yep.
Just speaks so more powerfully than any opinion, I think.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I was just thinking of, look, just before we finish, one of the things that people often talk about, like the no sort of voters will throw up is, but there are already Aboriginal politicians. They're your voice. Why do you need more? Why do you need more of a voice? So, interestingly, I think I saw an interview that they'd interviewed 11 Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander politicians. I think it was 9 of them, certainly 8, but I think 9, there might have been 8 that were for the voice, 1 that wasn't quite sure but generally was supportive, and 2 that were against. So the majority of Aboriginal politicians actually support the voice. And I think from what I've read, the reason is because they understand that as elected politicians, their primary accountability is actually to their electorate, which is predominantly non-Aboriginal people. So they're basically elected by non-Aboriginal people to serve the interests of that electorate. Many of them are also aligned with political parties, so they're also required to, what they say, toe the party line. They have to, speak to and advocate for whatever the policy positions are that have been determined by their party. Yeah. So they're not elected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or communities, and 2, they can't speak freely about their views on issues impacting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. The voice will be independent. It won't be aligned to any particular party. It will be, the members of the voice will be elected by their communities, from those communities, to advocate and to provide advice in relation to issues impacting those communities. So they won't be sort of hamstrung by needing to follow particular political agendas or particular political policies or those sorts of things. They will be able to, what they call, provide frank and fearless advice. Another thing people often say is, but there's hundreds of Aboriginal organisations that can already have a voice. Yes, there are many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations. What you'll find is that the vast majority of them run community programs that are funded by government at some level. Could be local, could be state, could be federal government funding. And we've all heard the saying, don't bite the hand that feeds you. So if you're a small Aboriginal organisation providing a really valuable and much needed service in a small community town or a region, and you've got some issues with the way your funding government is operating, you might not agree with them on some things. Do you take that government to task? Do you take that particular department to task over what they're doing and risk not being refunded next time round? Or do you say, look, we've got this money, we're doing some real good in our community, maybe we've got some broader concerns about what the government or the department are doing or how they're doing it, but we'll just make a decision to not, we don't want to bite the hand that feeds us. We don't want to risk upsetting them because we might not get funded next time. We might be seen as being ungrateful or something like that. So we'll just let it go. The beauty of the voice is that those organisations can actually talk to their voice representative, say, look, we want to do this sort of a bit discreetly, but these are the issues of concern in our particular area. The voice can then go and say, look, in this particular town or in this particular region, these are some of the issues that are impacting, these are some of the policies and processes that aren't working, that aren't hitting the ground the way you think they might be, and this is the advice we would give in terms of improving that. So the actual organisation can sort of keep out of it a little bit, and the voice can actually advocate and champion their cause in that sense. So that's why there's an organisation called the Coalition of Aboriginal Peak Organisations, which represents the interests of about 80 Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. And CAPO, which is the acronym for it, have said we support the voice because they get that. They get that the voice can actually stand alongside and walk alongside those organisations and help to raise their voices in a way that sort of keeps them out of the firing line in some ways. So yeah.
And at time of recording, I don't know if it's been officially announced yet, but there will be a referendum coming up in the near future, I guess. What would be your last word or your piece of advice for maybe listeners who have been come along on this journey with us over the last hour or so?
Thank you for listening. Yeah. Thank you for hanging in there. Look, we live in a democracy. And Australia is probably, I think, one of the world's best democracies. We've got a great country. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. There are a lot of countries in the world that are much less perfect. So we've got this country, we've got democracy. Every person gets to vote how they choose. I respect that. And, I would hope that a lot of people will vote yes. All I would say, if you think you are going to vote no, please think it through. Please make sure that you have a really good and reasonable reason for voting no. Not something you've heard on TikTok or Facebook or some sort of unsubstantiated claim about, the sky's going to fall or our democracy is going to end, or, some of these things that are, just misinformation, to be honest. And look, at the end of the day, if you have a really good reason that you can justify for voting no, do that. But I would just ask that you apply critical thinking to the information that you read, think it through. Please think about what I've said today. I'll be voting yes because, to be frank, I don't think in my lifetime I'll get another opportunity like this to try and make a positive change. I just don't think I'll get that chance. So for me, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity to try and make a positive difference. That's how I see it. That's how I encourage other people to view the Voice and to see the Voice. But as I said, at the end of the day, we're a democracy, so go well.
Absolutely. And if people wanted to, I don't know if we can edit this out if it's a no, but if people want to find you online to maybe chat further with you, where would be the best place to do that?
Look, my contact details are available via the Synod's First Nations Resources website. So if you just Google First Nations Resources UCA, the link to the website will come up. My email is on there, so people can contact me by email. Is probably the easiest way to start a conversation.
Sure, and we can put the link for that down below. So if you're watching and you have questions or further thoughts, comments, you can email us at filthyhopepod@gmail.com, or feel free to get in touch with Nathan. I'm sure you'd be more than happy to...
Always happy to have you on.
Continue the conversation. We'll see you next week. Again, thank you for listening. Thanks for joining us, Nathan. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We'll see you guys next time.
This is a prayer for the people who want to give up, who have been hurt beyond repair and cannot bear to see your face in anything. Find peace in letting go of the guilt that is in yours.